What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So this tier list is something that I've been wanting to do for a while. I feel like I've gone over my experience with Final Fantasy quite a bit on the channel, but for those of you who may not be aware or are jumping into this video prior to checking out the dedicated videos on these games, I was born in the mid-90s and my first video game console was a Nintendo 64. So obviously Final Fantasy had pivoted away from Nintendo by that point. And while there were potential opportunities for me to get into this series when I was young, be it on the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, Wii Virtual Console, etc. and so on, for whatever reason, I never decided to take the plunge at those times. It's been so long now that I couldn't exactly tell you why that is, but what's done is done. I didn't actually get around to playing most of these games for the first time until 2020, I believe it was. There were some that I started and didn't quite finish, but I eventually ended up playing the remaining games on this list that I hadn't at that time, and I even went and replayed a good number of the ones that I did play initially. Well, I do think that there is something to be said for playing games in a certain time and place, especially when it comes to how revolutionary certain games were at certain times. I think there's also something to be said for how these games may be perceived by people who weren't around at said time, even if they are very much aware and familiar with how important they may have been. There may be some points that I don't go into as much detail on, or I might synthesize those thoughts into something a little more compact since I've expounded on it previously, so as to not be repeating myself a lot of the time. I really want to get into some of those aspects that I haven't had a chance to discuss about each of these games. Now, I'm sure most of you who are watching this are probably pretty reasonable and understand, you know, context when it comes to video game discourse and rankings and all of that. But I guess I just want to make an appeal to those who may have grown up with these games and have very specific and steadfast opinions to try to keep an open mind. I've seen some people in the past get upset by the prospect of certain games in certain lists being in C tier or something like that. But the way that I tend to approach and view tier lists is that it's all relative, and usually it's relative from the top down. In my mind, there's not much difference between having the tiers be S, A, B, C versus quadruple S, triple S, double S, single S, because those letters alone shouldn't mean anything inherently. There may be a certain connotation associated with some of those rankings, but I've always had the highest tier on my tier list be S tier, and I don't have any intentions of changing that. If every game is an S tier, then it literally means nothing. So there has to be some kind of delineation. S tier is the very top of the top. These are games that I'm very likely to come back to time and again. A tier is going to be just that, a step below the S tier favorite game of all time kind of contenders, but still no doubt games that have points that I really love about them. The B tier are going to be the games that, while enjoyable, have some what I would view as glaring issues that prevent them from really resonating with me as much, even if there are aspects that I think are really cool and that I really like. And then the C tier are games that are kind of a hard sell for me to want to go back to, especially over the rest of the games on the list. And so with all of that context out of the way, let's get into the list proper. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me in the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations, as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. This of course includes channel memberships, which are something I'm always looking to add value to if you have any feedback on that. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. So, first and foremost, we have the original Final Fantasy. Of course, without this one existing, we would have not gotten the following entries. I tend to find that argument to fall flat when it comes to personally ranking games. To me, the historical context and stuff like that, while important in some regard, is kind of a whole nother conversation. Like, a game's historical significance may entice me to check it out, but I wouldn't say that it influences the way in which I may enjoy said game. So the original Final Fantasy, while it does have that historical significance and all of that, that's just not really a factor that I tend to consider when ranking games based on actually playing them. If I were to do a tier list on how impactful each of these games may or may not have been, that's like a totally different list, and also a list that sounds incredibly boring to make because it's something that's a lot more quantifiable and objective in some sense, just kind of looking at sales and cultural significance and how many sequels and stuff like that. Now, with that said, because my exposure to playing not only this first Final Fantasy, but also the other earlier titles was through the Pixel Remasters, it was a lot smoother of an experience. And so as far as the play experience of Final Fantasy I, while I did enjoy playing through the Pixel Remaster primarily for historical context, I think it's a little too bare bones for me to have that drive to go back to it. It's just a simple game, and that's understandable because it was an NES title and, you know, the first in this series, so it only kind of makes sense that these titles would get more complex to some extent as the series progressed. I don't really feel like I have a ton more to say on some of these early titles than I've already said, and so with all that said, said, Final Fantasy I is going to go in the C tier. Definitely not a bad game by any means, but it's a hard sell to go back to it over most of the other games on this list. So FF2 focuses more on its narrative. While the narrative in FF2 isn't anything amazing, there's at least something to latch on to, but the way FF2's dungeons are designed is particularly frustrating because it's not something that can really be easily fixed with an encounter toggle or experience boosters. That aspect that does make FF2's dungeons frustrating is the abundance of dead-end rooms, especially because some of these rooms have treasure chests, but then a good number of them don't. It's a really odd design choice because Final Fantasy I, at least in the Pixel Remaster, had some of this, but it was an instant thing where you would pass through a door and the camera would just focus on that single room instead of having it be a separate loading zone, seemingly. It makes the dungeon crawling in Final Fantasy II really tedious, even if you may have encounters turned off, even if you're trying to just mainline the story and not really explore and find treasure chests. And then you added this the way that characters progress in FF2, the fact that each individual weapon type along with your defense stat and stuff like that have to be trained on an individual basis. If you're going out of your way to grind in FF2, you're intentionally taking hits to raise your armor skill level. You're maybe intentionally using low-powered weapons to try to get more hits on enemies to try to level that up. It's just a really tedious system, and while I do appreciate in some sense the developers trying something different, as you saw with a lot of NES sequels in fact, I just don't think that that experimentation necessarily panned out. Some interesting ideas. There's like a dialogue, keyword kind of system, but it's a little simple and kind of just contributes to the tedium overall. So while I do appreciate the strides that FF2 took in the storytelling department compared to its predecessor, I think that systems-wise and just kind of the overall gameplay experience was a step back. So we're going to put FF2 at the bottom of the list. I feel like if I emulated the original versions of these games, or translated versions in FF2's case, it could probably warrant being in its own tier below, but the Pixel Remaster quality of life stuff kind of brings it more in line with FF1 overall. But regardless, FF2 is pretty easily at the bottom of this list. So FF3 takes some of the storytelling focus of 2 while pivoting its systems more back towards the original Final Fantasy with added flexibility in the form of the job system. Unlike in the first Final Fantasy where you pick your party members' classes at the beginning and they stay in said class for the duration of the game with, you know, an enhanced version of each class, maybe around the midpoint or so. FF3 allows you to change your party's classes, or jobs as they're called of course, whenever you want outside of battle. As far as I understand, it is best to keep your mage characters heading down that path, keeping your strength-based warrior-type characters down a similar path. But the fact of the matter is that there is more flexibility. Now, I think partially because this brand of flexibility was new to Final Fantasy in particular, the way that FF3 tries to incentivize you to change up your jobs is not the most tactful. The most infamous instance of this being the Garuda boss fight, where you pretty much have to make everyone dragoons and equip them with the appropriate equipment to beat that boss. It's very much a gimmick fight in that way, and I can't quite remember if there were other instances like that, but I feel like that alone, while understandable to be like, hey, you should be changing your jobs up, it has a similar kind of energy to boss fights that you're supposed to lose to for story reasons. I think the main issue as far as where I would rank this on the list is that there is a later title that pretty much does what FF3 does, but better in a lot of regards. While I do think it is a step above 1 and 2, it does remain outshined by the rest of the list, so FF3 is going to be the first B tier in this ranking. Now, one aspect spoiler-wise that I kind of hinted at in the original video that I want to expound on now is that each and every one of these games are linear as far as the progression of the main story. Most of them are also good about giving you a degree of freedom to not make it feel like you're railroaded, but there's also a good bit of that, especially in the early game for many of these titles. And I think some of that is good because a certain aspect of FF1 and especially 2, I think, that could make those experiences frustrating is that you can kind of just wander wherever for no particular reason. You're not going to find anything but high-level enemies that'll kick your shit in. So I think FF3's approach of guiding the player a little more directly in the early hours was refreshing. What I thought was really cool about FF3 was that you start out on what you might think is the world map at first. This initial map is actually just one small island on the grander world map. And so that reveal when you get the airship that allows you to leave was quite a moment, even playing this game decades later. The rest of the narrative, while there are some cool lore implications as far as the main antagonist's relationship to certain characters, I do find it to be kind of forgettable, but definitely more in line with how FF2 approached its storytelling, which is appreciated because it kind of shows this progression as we get towards Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV often gets credited as being this series' pivot towards more of a focus on storytelling, and part of that is because FF4 was the second Final Fantasy to make its way stateside, and so while FF2 is actually the progenitor of that focus, and FF3 kind of continues that to an extent, I still think that FF4 does elevate the storytelling angle past what the previous 3 titles did. Of course, you have that notable character arc of Cecil's shifting loyalty from the Empire that raised him, going from a Dark Knight to a Paladin, also having to deal with Kane's implied weaker mental mental state, so therefore being more susceptible to Golbez or really Zemus's mind control. There's some other story moments in FF4 that I think are cool, albeit pretty wild, but that's kind of part of Final Fantasy. The whole underground civilization angle. You've got the Giant of Babel, who is built by the Lunarians, I want to say they're called, that are a civilization based on the moon, and the fact that you even go to the moon, and then of course Cecil is a descendant of the Lunarians, etc., and so on. There's all these crazy revelations that, while cool on paper, I think the dialogue in particular doesn't do the potential of this story justice. I think it's definitely the best story at this point in the series. While 2 and 3 did have more of a narrative focus in the first game, characterization-wise, most of them are pretty flat, and in FF4 it's definitely a step above that, but it's still not really something that resonates with me. I enjoy it fine. I just think that the dialogue is written in a manner that's kind of stiff and dry. It's just very matter of fact. It's almost like there was minimal localization and it was more of a direct translation. And of course, when you directly translate Japanese, not sentence structure per se, but the cadence of that language, as far as my understanding of it, it does oftentimes come out in English as very matter of fact and kind of dry. From what little I've heard about the 3D remake of FF4 that was originally released on the DS, some story and character moments are more fleshed out and of course presented a little more cinematically. There are limitations there, in particular with the chibi models and all of that, but it is a version of the game that I'm interested to check out to kind of see if my opinion on the story and or characters might change to some degree. Because the party construction of FF4 is the same from playthrough to playthrough, I think it allowed for the devs to craft encounters and boss fights and dungeons and the like that are very intentional because they know what exactly you have at your disposal. So I think that the difficulty curve in FF4 is quite nice. I enjoyed it overall, especially considering that in the Pixel Remasters you could lower the experience boosters if you wanted a more challenging time. I went over this in my FF4 video, but I don't think I used the boosters at all in FF4, whereas the previous 3 titles I was heavily making use of them because it kind of felt mandatory in some sense to make meaningful progress on building my party in those games. I don't know that I feel so enticed by FF4 that I want to replay a version I've already played, but because there's so many different versions, it's like, yeah, I'll try a different version of FF4. I'm a little bit torn now because I am remembering how much I did generally enjoy the gameplay experience of Final Fantasy IV. I do enjoy the narrative and stuff like that as well. It's just the aspects that I mentioned, but then also the way that Final Fantasy IV handles characters dying, quote unquote. There will be this grand self-sacrifice moment, but then they end up being fine. I do think it does dull the impact of those moments on repeat playthroughs. I think that warrants keeping Final Fantasy IV in B tier, and in fact I think I prefer FF4 to FF3 enough to potentially have there be a tier differential there, but based on the games that I'm planning to put in the A tier, I don't think FF4 quite reaches those highs. But then as far as FF3, I don't think that FF3 has quite the same lows as the first 2 games. Maybe that would warrant this tier list being a 5 tier instead of a 4 tier, but it is what it is. Now moving on to Final Fantasy V, this is the game that in some sense sort of invalidates Final Fantasy III for me because it's got a very similar narrative structure. It's got an expanded and more customizable job system with characters and a narrative that are a little bit more interesting. Now, does Final Fantasy V's narrative stick the landing at all times? Not really, but I also kind of don't think FF5 gets enough credit for the more serious moments in its story. There's definitely a lot of goofs and gaffes in there for sure. Many of those don't stick the landing because they kind of try to do slapstick, but I just don't really think that works with like chibi pixel art sprites, at least in the way that FF5 does it in particular. I kind of like the party members of Final Fantasy V. I mean, they're not my favorite Final Fantasy party by any means, but FF5's party just has a really wholesome vibe, like the way that they learn to get along. Even when those comedic moments don't land, it kind of puts a smile on my face seeing the characters laugh, even if I may not be laughing myself. There are definitely plot moments that are sort of silly and I would maybe even say stupid, like Exdeath disguising himself as a Splinter. There is something to be said for meme potential, I guess, in the fact that it makes certain elements of a story that may be silly or stupid memorable, which is kind of an important thing. I would prefer for a story to be memorable for other reasons than meme potential personally. I do think that Exdeath is not really that compelling of a villain, but I at least cared about the party members enough to want to see them succeed in taking him down and preventing this destruction, even if some of it was unavoidable to my memory. Overall, story-wise, not the greatest Final Fantasy, but it's got a lot of heart, and I think enough serious moments and even enough character development for me to enjoy it, probably more than the titles that I've talked about thus far. This game tends to get shit on for its story and characters, and I don't feel like it's totally fair. But the thing that really elevates Final Fantasy V is its gameplay systems. So as I mentioned, the presence of Final Fantasy V kind of reduces my desire to replay FF3 because the job system is more flexible here and there's more tangible progression. Each job does have a specific skill that it comes with when you have it equipped. As you level up these jobs, you permanently acquire these skills to equip and pair with other jobs. There's a lot of flexibility there, which I think is cool, especially if you limit yourself in some way, which I feel like is easier to do here than in some of the other titles that get what I would argue to be too flexible. Final Fantasy V with its systems are what I would deem flexible with limitations. Yes, technically any character could equip any job and you could technically max all of them out, at which point there's a lot of bonuses and abilities and stat buffs that get applied to the freelancer class. By the end game, it's possible for all of your party members to be doing similar things. You can also just as easily stick to one single job for the duration of the entire game, and I find the prospect of doing runs like that in the future pretty enticing, especially because there's actually a community around Final Fantasy V that does just that, called the Final Fantasy V 4-Job Fiesta, which as far as I understand is a fundraising challenge that people partake in. Whether or not you take that angle or if you simply just apply these rules to any given Final Fantasy V run, I think it's a really novel and cool set of systems. I actually find the way that the bosses in particular are designed much of the time in FF5 do a better job at incentivizing rebuilding your party than FF3. There's never like a hard and fast mandate for that, but there were definitely bosses where it was clear I would benefit from having certain jobs equipped for said fight. Not necessarily a specific job, but more just pairing certain abilities with certain jobs or whatever. It's hard for me to think of specific examples because I am a good number of months removed from my playthrough, but it's something that I do think back on fondly when it comes to FF5 overall. FF5 is going to go in the A tier. While I can see myself going back to it primarily from that challenge run angle, as much as I did praise the story and characters, it's not something that fully resonates with me per se, which definitely does keep it out of the S tier, but I pretty easily prefer it to the other games that I've talked about thus far. Now, getting into Final Fantasy VI. I feel like I was pretty thorough in that FF6 video, so not really a ton more to say than I have already said. If we're talking about storytelling and characters in Final Fantasy, especially up to this point, FF6 is the perfect melding of compelling and fleshed out character arcs, and narrative that has twists and turns that, while surprising in some regard, never feel out of left field. Easily the most compelling antagonist thus far in Kefka. There's just so many great things I could say about Final Fantasy VI's narrative and character that I've not only spoken on prior, but has been praised to hell and back by many others as well. I've played through it twice now, and I will certainly play FF6 again someday, probably many times, simply because of how much I really love the story and character angle. Now, is there room to do even more in this regard? I would actually argue yes, even though I am content with what is there currently. A primary reason why there could be more done with FF6's character arcs in particular is because of the non-linear nature of the world of Ruin, and therefore the developers not necessarily knowing who is in your party at any given time, so it's kind of hard to give any of them a particular importance. Obviously, outside of the characters that are mandatory in that segment, which are not many, it was understandably difficult to have each and every one of them have a fully fleshed out and compelling character arc, and I would say most of them do, but a lot of it is something that's maybe set up to a certain degree in the world of balance, and then doesn't really go anywhere until the somewhat abrupt conclusion in the world of Ruin. It is something that I think could be expounded on and fleshed out further, but for me at least, it's not really that big of a sticking point when it comes to FF6, because I think what it does well in the narrative and character department outshines the potential drawbacks. Now, from a gameplay standpoint, everyone has a set class in FF6, of course, so they have each of their unique abilities, which tend to be their most powerful option, as far as at least the ones that are offensive oriented. There's not really a cost to using a blitz with Sabin over a standard attack, and the blitzes tend to be much more powerful. If you know what you're doing, you would hardly ever be using the attack command with Sabin. The execution of combat encounters, be it regular enemies or bosses, does largely end up feeling kind of predictable. Now, of course, you have the ATB angle. That does add somewhat of an X factor to the execution of said fights, especially because of the small tweaks that were made to the ATB system in 6 in particular, because there usually is like one best option to be selecting, and because those options tend to be so powerful, it's hard to justify doing anything else at a certain point. You could technically, I guess, argue that for a lot of games, especially turn-based ones, but I do like that each character does have a distinct identity in that way. On the flip side of that, you have the Esper system, which kind of does the opposite and can end up making the characters feel very samey. There's certain limitations you could put on yourself. I personally would prefer to see some of those limitations be actually implemented into the game design. I don't know exactly how you would go about it, but just some sort of limitation on something to kind of prevent the characters from feeling overly samey by the end of the game. And of course, you have to go out out of your way to grind out Ultima on characters and stuff. If you do opt to do that, like I was saying with the character-specific abilities, it's just hard to justify clicking anything else at that point. That kind of brings me to a point overall with these first 9 games. I'm not really here for the gameplay per se. I, by and large, like a lot of the back-end system kinds of stuff, be it the job system, the Esper system, and some of the systems that come up in the PS1 games as well, but some of these systems are so flexible, and I know some players really like playing RPGs from the angle of how can I break this, which you can definitely go out of your way to do if you couple game knowledge with the time it would take to grind a lot of these things out, because that's oftentimes what it does end up boiling down to, is time and patience to do said grinding to break whatever aspect of the game you're trying to break. But that's not really why I tend to play RPGs, especially JRPGs. I don't really care so much about how much I can break open the game. I would much rather have a game that has a more directed difficulty curve. Of course, you don't want game progression to be so rigid that every playthrough is exactly the same. In that sense, it's better to lean on the more flexible side than not, to allow for players to switch up their runs on subsequent playthroughs. But I feel like FF6 is the game where that flexibility starts to get carried away a little too much, and that continues for a few entries. I enjoy the gameplay for most of these games in the moment, but it's not really the draw for me as much as I do really love this series at this point. And so for me, especially when it comes to Final Fantasy, but really like JRPGs in general, I think story and characters are the more important factor overall. Despite having some issues with the flexibility of the systems in FF6, it's still an S tier. It's one that comes to mind when I think my favorite games in this series and my favorite games in the genre, and I think it's pretty easy to understand why that is. Moving on to the big one, Final Fantasy VII. I've been less than tactful about my thoughts on this game in the past, and it's something that I feel like I've gotten better at as I've played and talked about more Final Fantasy games, and kind of changed the angle at which I approach making videos as well to a certain extent. There's not a dedicated video on Final Fantasy VII specifically on the channel. There is a video on FF7 Remake, which does touch on my impressions of certain aspects of the original, but of course, Remake only covers a small portion of the original game's story, so there's only so much that I really wanted to dig into there, but this is not a discussion about 7 Remake. Let's talk about the original Final Fantasy VII. Hugely impactful, obviously. How ignorant would I have to be to not know how impactful FF7 was? It's one of those things that was unavoidable, even a decade plus later, if you were perusing video game forums and the like. The jump from 2D to 3D games was huge, and was a complete shift in what video games could be. The N64 being my first system introduced me to some of those early polygonal titles. Granted, because I was the oldest, and my parents had no wherewithal about what games to buy, or like what was worth playing, or what's appropriate for a young child, or like, you know, whatever it is. My exposure to those landmark titles was pretty limited at the time. It wasn't really until the Wii Virtual Console that I delved into a lot of retro offerings. Not just N64 games that I didn't play despite owning one, but also games from the NES and Super Nintendo era that I fell completely in love with, and many more that I've played since then. But obviously, because FF7 was a PlayStation game and had a lineage there, it wasn't on any Nintendo systems until the Switch, I want to say. And that's how I initially played FF7, was the remaster version, quote unquote, on Switch, which, as far as I can tell, really didn't change very much as far as the remastering side of things. It's, I guess, technically running at a higher res, but they didn't change the character models or like anything super major from a presentational standpoint. So I feel like I generally got a pretty authentic experience, albeit with a better translation / localization than the original release, of course. Final Fantasy VII, in fact, was the first of these 9 games that I played when delving into them back in 2020. And so on my initial play of FF7, I overall really enjoyed it, particularly from a narrative standpoint. Every time I've attempted to replay Final Fantasy VII, I end up losing interest somewhere during disc 1. And that is really the big issue that I have with Final Fantasy VII. Spoiler alert, for probably the most infamous spoiler in video game history, I find the first disc, which for those of you who aren't aware of when that might end, it's when Aerith dies, to be kind of a slog. There's several contributing factors as to why I think this is, but before I dig into that, let's talk about the positive. Pretty much everything that happens in disc 2 is like my favorite part of Final Fantasy VII, and really what made my overall experience with it stand out. The moment at the glacier when Cloud hands Sephiroth the black materia, everything goes to shit. Sephiroth casts Meteor, which sets the planet on a trajectory of impending doom, alongside of all of the environmental damage that's been done, and there's a lot of, you know, strong themes in that regard of technology versus nature and all of that. That theming in particular isn't something that really resonated with me too much in the original game, but it is there. Just Cloud as a character, I think, is incredible. It's one of my absolute favorite parts about Final Fantasy VII, and one of the standout characters in Final Fantasy in general. I fucking love Cloud Strife. He's a fantastic character and is maybe my favorite main character in Final Fantasy thus far. And of course you have the weapons that get awoken when all the shit goes down. Jenova's manipulation of Sephiroth and like who's really in control. There's just so much really fucking cool shit in Final Fantasy VII's narrative. I guess that brings me to certain aspects of FF7 overall that make that first disc especially a slog to get through. And there's kind of a lot, so brace yourselves. From the characterization angle, Cloud's awesome. The rest of the cast though, not really something that resonates for me. There's a few different factors to this. So you've got the chibi models, which here we go, someone taking jabs at Final Fantasy VII for its graphics. It's not really anything to do with the graphics specifically. I'm not really a fan of 3D chibi, just kind of generally speaking. There are definitely games that I've enjoyed that take this approach, but I would obviously prefer a version of said game that doesn't have that, primarily because not the resolution or the graphics specifically, but really it's about the animations and therefore in a lot of regards characterization. It's just really hard to take some of these characters seriously when Barrett's, you know, waving his arms around like a fucking maniac. I guess it's endearing in some sense. You can use your imagination to a certain degree to like try to picture what they're going for, but the chibi models are distracting and I feel like do detract from the potential to connect with the majority of the characters in the original FF7. That is more so the issue with a lot of PS1 and N64 games, even my absolute favorite games of that generation. The N64 Zeldas, for instance, I really love, but I'm not fucking plugging in my N64 and playing the original versions of those games. I'm playing the damn decompilations slash recompilations on PC that run at like a stable frame rate and, you know, some additional buttons to map. And those improvements alone elevate those games way past playing them on original hardware, like whatever. Even though I do have experience playing both of those games through the Wii Virtual Console in particular, which were at their, you know, 20 FPS original selves. But with FF7, you upscale it in the same way and it just doesn't work because it's more so the models. It's more so the animations. It's not enough to simply up-res to make the characters something that I'm able to buy into as much as I can, even Final Fantasy VI in its pixel art form. I think part of that is because Square had obviously mastered what they can do on the Super Nintendo, whereas on the PS1 they were breaking new ground. And I respect that, I really do. But it's not just the chibi models. You also have a similar issue to FF6, albeit with a smaller cast, as far as the extent to which these character arcs go. A big part of that is because you can only have 3 characters in your party at any given time, and so those might as well be the only 3 characters that exist for the vast majority of story scenes. I understand there is some element of quote-unquote replayability. You can replay the game with different party setups and see what each of them have to say, and that kind of is a unique element from playthrough to playthrough, but to me, that is simultaneously such a small difference as far as replayability, but also such a major hindrance to the characterization of anyone not in your party that it just kind of takes me out of things in that regard. Now, FF6 does this as well, because of course, the 5 games before FF6 all had specific party members that were in your party at specific times. It was always set. So similar to what I've said gameplay-wise about games like FF4, the developers could specifically craft character moments for them, as simple as they might be in the early titles, obviously, but FF6 and then now FF7 allowing you to be flexible in who's in your party at any given time is nice, especially from a gameplay angle to a certain extent, but from a narrative angle, it just really limits the characterization of these characters, and the majority of Disc 1 is kind of like these isolated character arcs, like Barrett when you get to Corel and the Gold Saucer and his backstory with Dyne and Marlene and like all of that. I really like that segment of the game from a characterization standpoint for Barrett, but then if you don't have Barrett in your party, he just might as well not exist. He's not there to comment on things, he's not there to show further character growth and all of that, and like you see some of that with his respect for Cloud later on the airship and stuff like that, sure, but then it kind of feels like it was coming out of nowhere if you weren't using Barrett in your party prior. And that's part of the reason why Aerith's death didn't really resonate with me either, because I just find her to be characterized in kind of a bland fashion. Maybe the dialogue and localization is a little stiff on top of, like I was saying, the animations and chibiness of the characters being kind of a little stiff and hard to get attached to. And you might say, oh, well, Aerith's death wasn't impactful to you because you knew about it ahead of time, because like how couldn't you know about that if you were perusing gaming forums at the time that I was? But there have been other games that have major character deaths that I knew about ahead of time that still did hit me incredibly hard. So I don't think that that factor is particularly relevant. I think a major aspect as to why these character interactions, or I guess lack thereof, depending on who's in your party, are so important to this first disc of FF7 is because plot-wise, not really much actually happens. After Midgar, which does have more interesting story sequences because it's much more directed and linear, but once you leave Midgar, it's kind of like time to track down Sephiroth, but no one has a lead, and so it's kind of like aimlessly wandering and trying to track him down. There are those moments where you feel like you're hot on his trail and stuff, stuff, like when you see the Zolom or whatever it's called impaled, when a Genova Sephiroth clone shows up on the ship, and, you know, some other moments here and there. But without sufficient party banter from everyone, I feel like that kind of storytelling angle falls flat for me, especially when you interject with these isolated character arcs that don't really have a ton of bearing on tracking down Sephiroth per se. They're kind of interstitials. Another factor that makes Disc 1 kind of a drag is the mini games, and I don't just mean the mini games at the Gold Saucer. The Gold Saucer is literally designed to be like Las Vegas, where you can just waste your time away there. I think that's fine. That's actually good narrative gameplay synergy. My issue is the hiding behind the statue thing when you're climbing the Shinra building. Even when you're ascending towards Shinra headquarters and you gotta like plug in the thing and jump at the right time, and none of them are particularly difficult per se, but just kind of annoying. Even if it is like a minor inconvenience, it's a bunch of minor inconveniences. It's very much kind of a death by a thousand cuts sort of scenario when it comes to these. If you want to call them mini games, I would maybe even call them QTE-esque. There's definitely some mods on PC that can help with some of the sticking points that I have, but only so far. Like, I don't think there's a mod that removes a lot of the quick time event minigame kinds of stuff. There's probably a retranslation mod that characterizes the characters better. I know that there are model replacement mods as well. I haven't even talked about the gameplay aspects at all. The materia system's cool. The flexibility is nice. I think it falls into a similar trap that FF6 did, where the characters become very homogenized, especially so in FF7, because aside from limit breaks, which I know are a major component to the game, I feel like the gauges fill up so fast that I find that I'm using these same limit breaks over and over and over again in a way that makes the combat kind of predictable and sort of boring. There's not really a distinct gameplay identity for anyone. The things that they can do are based pretty much entirely around what materia they have equipped, so everyone functions more or less the same in combat. The flexibility is nice, like I was saying, but the game is so easy that it doesn't really demand you participate in the materia system beyond the surface level. I get it. You pair the elemental materia with an element for resistance or elemental damage, and there's like other pairings that you can do, and builds I guess you can craft with the materia and stuff. That's fine, but what you end up doing with those builds in a combat sense, I don't find that it's really incentivized that you go super hard into this particular system. As much as I do like it on paper, it's like I was saying earlier, I like the systems in each of these games, but the way in which it impacts the overall combat experience is something that I tend to find lacking. On the first play, you've got that mystery angle of you don't know what's going to happen. That can be enough to drive you forward, and it certainly was for me. And then you get to disc 2 and it's actually interesting and the payoff is there. On a replay though, it's just hard to justify going through all of that. Now, will I try again someday? I'm sure I will. I guess as far as the replaying thing, I just think that my willingness to replay a game, while not the end-all be-all, it's an easy tell as far as how much I enjoyed my time with it. Am I willing to re-experience this, even if there might not be a ton of variance from playthrough to playthrough? And then if there is, great, all the better. And so with FF7 being a game that I really love certain aspects of, but have struggled to replay for varying reasons as well, is going to go in the A tier. It is undoubtedly one of the better games on this list, not because of its cultural impact or how groundbreaking it was at the time. It is simply a matter of the highs being so high that it counteracts a lot of the low points and eclipses even the highest points of many of the other games on this list. Final Fantasy VIII is a game that I respect a lot more, having played it a second time, which is what my video on it is about, is that second playthrough. To kind of boil down some of the talking points of that video, a lot of narrative revelations in FF8 are not particularly tactful or foreshadowed, I think, in a way that races the player for them. There is such a thing as too much foreshadowing, for sure, but there's a lot of plot revelations in FF8 that, if you're not prepared for them, just seem completely stupid, for lack of a better term. And I still kind of think that some of those revelations are sort of dumb, but because I knew to expect it, I kind of accept the game's narrative for what it is. Spoiler alert, as messy as the time travel, time loop kinds of things are, the concept and a lot of the trippier sequences, and even some plot revelations, I just think are really cool from a conceptual level, to where I feel like I can kind of overlook some of the execution blunders, but the execution blunders are definitely something that holds this game back. FF8, I guess, technically remedies a big criticism I had of FF7's characters, where there's only 6 party members, and so everyone is present when they need to be for specific events, and they have specific roles in the story because of that. I think the issue is that the characters are sort of one note and maybe a little bit tropey. Maybe they are different by the end of the game, but it's not something that I feel is built upon developmentally. I feel like Squall and Renoa, to an extent, are the closest to characters that I think have convincing character arcs. I really dig the more modern, futuristic kind of stuff going on, and as dumb as the story can get, I kind of still like it for what it is. Now, from a gameplay standpoint, I mentioned already that the prospect of breaking a JRPG open systems-wise is not really a big draw for me. FF8 is really one of those that you can just crack wide open if you take the time to do so early on, probably more so than any other game on this list. I went into the junction system pretty deeply in my dedicated video, so I don't really want to repeat myself and go into it because it's kind of complicated. The main problem is that the UI and the menuing and stuff like that is really tedious. I think that there are a number of ways that you could take this system, remove a lot of the tedium out of it, but still keep the really cool aspects to it. FF8 is tricky to rank. As cool as I think that a lot of the concepts narratively and aesthetically and stuff like that are in FF8, it's not something that I feel confident that I would replay like 5, so it would go in the B tier. Given the pretty lengthy video I've done on it already and what I've said in this video, I think I've made my stance toward FF8 pretty clear, even if I may be a little bit confused about it, in fact. Final Fantasy IX is probably my favorite game on this list when it comes to the story. I think that the characters that do have full arcs and are ultimately the most important to the plot are done justice, being the main quartet of Zidane, Vivi, Garnet, and Steiner, with the other characters in the party having mostly solid character arcs, but ones that kind of leave them irrelevant after a certain point. But it is one of those where I think characterization-wise, the highs definitely outweigh the lows, and I think narratively, this is going to get into spoilers, I guess. The way that the story builds, I think, is quite fantastic. The opening sequence is really great. Then obviously things do kind of slow down for a little while to kind of foreshadow some things when it comes to characters and plot. And by the time you get to Burmisia, things have really kicked off. And then pretty much the entire rest of the game is awesome narratively, aside from Disc 3 starts out solid because the end of Disc 2 is like such a major event. And so I like a lot of those early moments. The party gets captured by Kuja and then you have to like go run this errand for him and stuff. That specific part of the story is, I think, somewhat notably weaker than the rest of the game. The party splits up to go get the crystals, but you don't really play out each of those segments thoroughly from what I'm recalling, at least. That's an aspect that I think could have been fleshed out a little bit more. Gameplay wise, this game is not as flexible as the previous ones. You learn these skills from leveling up equipment, but not every character learns every skill. There's enough there to make each character feel unique, since it is back to each character being a specific class and therefore having a specific set of abilities they can use in battle. I think that the battles in all of the PS1 games drag to a certain degree, but yeah, 9 is kind of infamous for being especially slow, partially because you have 4 party members on the field instead of 7 and 8's 3 party members. It's just slow in general. This is a very late PS1 title, so clearly pushing the system to its limits. And because the way games tended to run in that generation, it doesn't bode well for Final Fantasy IX in its vanilla state. But yeah, with all that said, the character and story stuff in Final Fantasy IX I love so much that it's easily in the S tier. Now, whether it goes above FF6 or below, it's so tricky because I think as an overall package, you factor in gameplay and story and characters and stuff. Maybe 6 gets the edge because 9 has some gameplay decisions that are a little questionable compared to 6, where I still have issues in that regard, but they're not really uniquely FF6 problems, where some of 9's gameplay problems are sort of unique to it. I think the story and characters I probably prefer in FF9, but both are great. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that 9 is probably my favorite Final Fantasy, but again, it really just depends on when you ask me. I think 9 and 6 are undoubtedly competing for those first 2 slots, and I think the order beyond that is pretty accurate as far as this list is concerned. It's possible that I talked about some of these aspects in my other videos, so I would once again suggest that you go check those out if you're interested to hear more on my thoughts on any one of these games. And if, you know, you want to watch a video that's a little more focused, definitely more Final Fantasy videos to look forward to. I do intend to play through the remaining single player Final Fantasy games at the very least that I haven't yet. And then we can see about delving into the MMOs, but that's just not really something that I'm looking to get into at the current moment. Let me know down in the comments what your Final Fantasy ranking would be, whether you want to do the tier list structure or whether you just want to do a simple list of your favorite to least favorite, even if you haven't played all of them. Curious to hear about that. I do, of course, want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.